The cold statistics of the massive aerial conflict needed a human face to convey the true cost of the air war. The numbers on the chalkboards represented the fierce actions of individual men fighting for their lives and their absent homes. One specific engagement high above the English coast demonstrated the absolute bond between the foreign warriors and their hosts. A massive formation of German bombers approached the vital port facilities with a strong escort of fast interceptors. The radar operators vectored a mixed group of British and Polish fighters to intercept the dark, massive threat. The British Spitfires climbed to the highest altitudes to engage the sleek German escort fighters in the thin air. The Polish Hurricanes took the lower route to intercept the heavy bombers before they could drop their massive payloads. The division of labor utilized the specific mechanical strengths of the different aeronautical machines. The Spitfire possessed the speed to hunt the enemy fighters, while the Hurricane possessed the rugged stability to smash the bombers. The coordinated tactic represented a brilliant fusion of strategic planning and raw, aggressive execution. A young British pilot found himself isolated from his main squadron after a chaotic merge with the enemy escorts. Two German fighters spotted the lone Spitfire and dove from the clouds to secure an easy and fast kill. The British aviator pushed his throttle to the firewall and initiated a steep dive to escape the deadly crossfire. Armor-piercing rounds tore through his metal wings and shattered his instrument panel in a shower of bright sparks. His damaged machine began to trail thick black smoke and lose altitude at a terrifying and rapid pace. The Polish pilots of the 303 Squadron spotted the desperate struggle from their lower combat position. The exiled commander broke his attack run on the heavy bombers and turned his Hurricane toward the falling British plane. He understood the profound value of a single Allied life in the massive grinder of the brutal conflict. The Polish warrior pushed his Merlin engine past its safe limits to reach the vulnerable machine in time. He placed his rugged fighter between the smoking Spitfire and the pursuing German Predators. The German pilots expected the interfering Hurricane to perform a standard evasive turn to avoid a direct head-on collision. But the Polish aviator held his course and charged straight at the leading enemy interceptor with absolute massive aggression. The sheer nerve of the foreign volunteer forced the German pilot to break his pursuit and pull away in pure panic. The Polish warrior squeezed his firing button and sent a massive stream of lead into the exposed bottom of the fleeing machine. The enemy fighter exploded into a massive ball of orange fire and spinning metal debris. The second German interceptor attempted to avenge his fallen comrade and turned his weapons on the rugged Hurricane. The Polish pilot used the superb turning radius of the British machine to outmaneuver the faster enemy plane. He pulled a massive turn that strained the canvas fabric of his flight controls and the muscles of his arms. The heavy forces pinned him to his seat as he brought his massive 8 machine guns to bear on the new target. He fired a continuous burst that severed the right wing of the German fighter. The crippled enemy machine spiraled toward the dark waters of the Channel and vanished beneath the cold waves. The Polish pilot leveled his Hurricane and pulled up alongside the damaged British Spitfire. The young British aviator looked across the small gap between the two machines and saw the face of his savior. The exiled warrior offered a simple salute and pointed his gloved hand toward the safety of the green English coast. The unspoken gesture communicated a massive volume of shared respect and profound mutual dedication. The Polish fighter escorted the smoking British machine all the way back to the grass airstrip of their shared base. The ground crews watched the two damaged aircraft perform a tense and difficult landing on the uneven dirt. The British mechanics rushed to extinguish the small fires burning in the engine cowling of the shattered Spitfire. The young pilot climbed out of his cockpit and walked straight toward the rugged Hurricane of the foreign volunteer. He extended his hand to the man who had risked everything to save a complete stranger in the massive chaos. The profound handshake between the two men symbolized the ultimate success of the joint aerial defense network. The strict British commanders witnessed the interaction and understood the true value of their fierce new brothers in arms. The foreign volunteers were not just mercenaries fighting a separate war of pure and isolated vengeance. They were dedicated guardians of the island nation, who valued the lives of their hosts as much as their own. The spilled blood and the shared trauma erased the massive borders that separated the two proud cultures. The Polish pilots treated the British mechanics and the sector controllers as vital members of their own extended group. They shared their meager rations and their stories of the lost homeland in the dark hours between the massive raids. The British personnel listened to the tragic tales of the brutal invasion and gained a new understanding of the raw Polish fury. The profound grief of the exiled men fueled their relentless drive to destroy the massive German war machine. The island defenders realized the foreign warriors were fighting to avenge a massive and unspeakable trauma. This deep emotional connection transformed the 303 Squadron into the most motivated unit in the entire sector. The men fought with a desperate intensity that terrified the veteran German bomber crews. The Luftwaffe airmen reported facing a swarm of absolute madmen who ignored the basic instincts of self-preservation. The enemy commanders could not devise a tactical countermeasure against men who welcomed the absolute closest combat ranges. The psychological impact of the aggressive defense degraded the morale of the entire massive German invasion force. The rugged Hawker Hurricane became a massive symbol of this defiant and fierce resistance. The British engineers designed a machine that could absorb the profound punishment of the close-quarters brawls. The thick wings and the reliable engine brought the Polish pilots home even after suffering massive structural damage. The foreign volunteers trusted the British steel with their lives and pushed the airframes to achieve impossible maneuvers. The combination of the sturdy machine and the fearless pilot proved superior to the advanced aeronautical designs of the enemy. The mechanics worked through the night to repair the massive holes in the wings of the Polish fighters. They scavenged spare parts from shattered planes to ensure the squadron had a full roster for the dawn patrols. The British ground crews possessed a massive amount of pride in the incredible kill records of their assigned foreign pilots. They painted the white victory crosses on the side of the machines with a profound sense of shared accomplishment. The victories belonged to the men who pulled the triggers and the men who loaded the heavy ammunition belts. A massive German raid targeted the specific airfield of the 303 Squadron to eliminate the massive threat. Dozens of heavy bombers approached the grass strip with a massive escort of high-altitude fighters. The warning sirens wailed, and the Polish pilots sprinted toward their armed and fueled machines. They took off into a sky filled with falling bombs and exploding anti-aircraft shells. The exiled warriors refused to let the enemy destroy their new home without a massive and brutal fight. The Polish commander ordered his men to ignore the escort fighters and focus absolute destruction on the heavy bombers. The Hurricanes climbed through the thick smoke of the initial explosions and intercepted the massive enemy formation. The fierce warriors opened fire at point-blank range and shattered the glass noses of the leading German machines. The aggressive assault disrupted the precise aiming process of the enemy bombardiers and saved the vital hangars below. The bombs hit the empty dirt of the surrounding dense forests. The British anti-aircraft gunners on the ground paused their fire to watch the massive spectacle above their heads. They cheered as the Polish fighters tore massive gaps in the tight defensive boxes of the German armada. The foreign volunteers fought with a protective rage that matched the intense dedication of the local British defenders. The exiled men considered the grass airfield their sacred ground and defended it with absolute massive prejudice. The sky rained burning German metal and shattered aluminum down upon the green English countryside. The successful defense of the airfield solidified the legendary status of the fierce foreign volunteers. The British base commander issued a profound commendation to the men of the 303 Squadron. He acknowledged their absolute courage and their vital role in the survival of the massive sector defense network. The rigid rules and the initial doubts were buried forever beneath the immense pile of destroyed enemy aircraft. The Polish pilots stood as honored and permanent members of the Royal Air Force. The story of the lone Polish fighter saving the damaged British Spitfire spread throughout the various fighter command stations. The tale boosted the morale of the exhausted young aviators who faced the massive numerical superiority of the enemy. The British pilots knew they possessed fierce guardians who would dive into a massive crossfire to protect their vulnerable machines. The mutual trust between the different squadrons created an impenetrable shield of coordinated aerial violence. The German forces could not break a defensive line united by shared sacrifice and profound mutual respect. The air war was a massive machine that consumed human lives and raw industrial materials at a staggering rate. But the brutal conflict also produced moments of profound human connection that transcended the massive chaos of the battlefield. The handshake on the dirt runway represented the massive triumph of the Allied spirit over the dark forces of tyranny. The men of two shattered nations found common ground in the cramped cockpits of their rugged fighter planes. The shared mission to destroy the massive enemy threat forged a bond stronger than the thickest armor plate. The raw statistics of the massive battle continued to grow as the autumn weather brought thick clouds and heavy rain. The Polish squadron maintained its position as the most lethal interceptor unit in the entire British defensive command. The exiled warriors never lost their profound aggression or their intense desire to strike the hated German invaders. They continued to utilize the brilliant British machines to exact a massive and bloody toll on the massive enemy swarms. The skies of the island nation belonged to the brave men who fought with combined steel and raw fury. The historians would later dissect the massive aerial campaign and analyze the pivotal factors of the ultimate Allied victory. They would point to the brilliant radar network and the superior production capacity of the British aviation factories. But the true deciding factor was the unyielding spirit of the men who operated the massive defensive systems. The infusion of the Polish fury provided the critical spark that ignited the massive engine of the British resistance. The fierce foreign volunteers gave the island nation the exact massive aggressive edge it needed to survive. The surviving pilots of the fierce squadron would always remember the massive roar of their reliable British engines. They would honor the memories of the brave British mechanics who kept their shattered machines in the air. The massive aerial conflict proved that absolute victory required the combined strength and the shared sacrifice of dedicated allies. The men of the 303 Squadron wrote a massive chapter of heroic history in the cold and unforgiving skies. The island of Britain remained a free and massive fortress because the foreign warriors held the absolute line. The German High Command anticipated a fast and decisive end to the massive air war over the Channel. They expected the island defenses to crumble under the extreme weight of their constant bombing raids. But the combination of British engineering and Polish aggression created an impenetrable wall of steel in the clouds. The invaders struck the shield and found themselves bleeding men and machines at an unsustainable rate. The grand strategic vision of a conquered Britain began to fracture under the intense pressure of the fierce defense. The German bomber crews experienced a profound shift in their own combat morale. The initial confidence of the summer missions dissolved into a cold and paralyzing terror by the autumn months. They knew the radar network of the Royal Air Force would track their formations from the moment they departed France. The element of surprise was a dead concept in the modern and organized British defensive system. The enemy airmen crossed the cold water with a dark sense of impending and absolute doom. The sight of the Hawker hurricane became a constant source of psychological trauma for the German gunners. The rugged British interceptors absorbed brutal amounts of return fire without breaking off their aggressive attack runs. The enemy crews watched their armor-piercing rounds bounce off the thick glass and the heavy metal of the defending machines. The Polish pilots pushed these durable aircraft into the tightest and most dangerous combat spaces. The German formations could not maintain their rigid discipline when the foreign warriors entered the chaotic brawl. The point-blank tactics of the 303 Squadron shattered the nerves of the veteran German aviators. A standard fighter plane attacking from a distance allowed the bomber crews to return fire with calculated precision. But the exiled warriors closed the distance so fast that the German gunners froze in sheer panic. The deafening roar of the Merlin engines drowned out the frantic commands of the enemy captains. The Polish fighters tore through the tight defensive boxes like a violent storm of pure metal and fire. The Luftwaffe generals commanded their escort fighters to protect the vulnerable bombers at all costs. The sleek German interceptors held an extreme speed advantage over the heavier British defensive machines. But the speed meant nothing in the chaotic and twisting dogfights orchestrated by the aggressive Polish pilots. The foreign volunteers used the superior turning radius of the hurricane to trap the fast enemy planes in a massive horizontal grinder. The German pilots found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned by men who fought with absolute and profound rage. The loss of experienced German flight leaders degraded the overall combat effectiveness of the invading armada. The fierce British and Polish defenders targeted the command planes to maximize the massive confusion in the air. A bomber formation without its lead navigator often dropped its payload into the empty ocean and retreated. The Royal Air Force understood that breaking the chain of command was just as vital as destroying the machines. The aggressive foreign warriors excelled at identifying and eliminating the crucial targets of the massive enemy offensive. The German intelligence officers struggled to explain the staggering casualty rates to their supreme commanders. They blamed the massive losses on bad weather and the unexpected resilience of the British aviation factories. The officers refused to admit that a group of exiled foreign pilots had broken the spirit of their elite airmen. The propaganda machine of the Dark Empire demanded a narrative of absolute and massive superiority. Acknowledging the profound skill of the Polish warriors would shatter the myth of the invincible German military. The psychological defeat in the air translated into immense strategic failures on the ground. The planned invasion of the island nation required absolute aerial dominance to protect the crossing barges. The relentless defense mounted by the British and Polish pilots denied the enemy this crucial and massive prerequisite. The German generals postponed the amphibious assault as the burning wreckage of their bombers littered the English countryside. The fierce alliance in the sky had saved the free world from a massive and dark occupation. The German pilots captured after bailing out of their shattered machines offered a grim perspective on the intense battle. They sat in the British interrogation rooms and spoke of a massive swarm of aggressive and insane interceptors. The prisoners described the Polish pilots as demons who ignored the basic instincts of self-preservation. The sheer terror in the eyes of the captured enemy airmen validated the brutal tactics of the foreign volunteers. The psychological warfare waged by the 303 Squadron was a massive and absolute triumph. The mechanics on the captured French airfields worked in a state of constant and sheer dread. They watched the decimated bomber squadrons return with dead gunners and shattered engines. The ground crews washed the blood from the German cockpits and patched the massive holes torn by the British guns. The severe damage inflicted by the Hawker hurricanes proved the immense destructive power of the massive 8-gun batteries. The German engineers could not build machines fast enough to replace the massive and unprecedented losses. The British sector controllers monitored the changing tactics of the invading enemy force. The Luftwaffe abandoned the massive daylight raids and shifted to the cover of absolute darkness. The German High Command hoped the night would protect their vulnerable bombers from the fierce Polish and British interceptors. This massive shift in strategy was a clear admission of defeat in the brutal battle for the sun. The enemy surrendered the daylight skies to the brave men who flew the rugged British machines. The darkness offered a brief and temporary shield for the battered German bomber crews. The Royal Air Force adapted to the new massive threat with brilliant innovations in airborne radar systems. The British engineers transformed their heavy twin-engine fighters into lethal predators of the night. The Polish pilots transferred their aggressive instincts to the dark and complex new arena of combat. The enemy could hide in the shadows, but they could never escape the massive reach of the Allied defense. The failure of the grand aerial offensive bred resentment and deep paranoia within the German High Command. The Supreme Leader blamed the generals for the profound inability to crush the isolated island nation. The generals blamed the massive intelligence failures and the unexpected production capacity of the British factories. The shifting of blame highlighted the massive cracks forming in the foundation of the Dark Empire. The fierce resistance of the British and Polish warriors had poisoned the core of the German war machine. The Polish pilots of the 303 Squadron noticed the sudden drop in enemy morale during the late autumn engagements. The German fighter escorts became hesitant and less aggressive in their massive defensive maneuvers. The exiled warriors smelled the fear in the air and pressed their massive advantage with renewed vigor. They chased the fleeing enemy machines back across the cold channel and claimed massive final victories. The hunters had become the absolute masters of the massive aerial domain. The giant piles of twisted aluminum in the British scrap yards served as a monument to the German defeat. The metal harvested from the fallen enemy machines was melted down and used to build more British aircraft. The fierce Polish pilots were shooting down the invaders and providing the raw materials for their own massive defense. This massive and brutal cycle of destruction and rebirth sustained the island nation through the darkest days of the massive conflict. The German war machine was feeding the massive engine of its own absolute demise. The British civilians emerged from their underground shelters and looked at the clear skies with a deep sense of relief. The constant roar of the air raid sirens was replaced by the beautiful sound of the returning Merlin engines. The people of London knew the brave British mechanics and the fierce Polish pilots had saved their historic city. The island nation had weathered the massive storm and stood unbroken against the greatest military threat in history. The profound gratitude of the citizens was a massive and permanent tribute to the defenders. The exiled warriors realized they had inflicted a historic defeat upon their hated enemy. They had not yet liberated their homeland, but they had shattered the massive illusion of German invincibility. The Polish pilots proved that the Dark Empire could bleed and lose massive amounts of men and heavy machines. The massive victory in the skies over Britain offered a profound beacon of hope to the captive nations of Europe. The resistance movements across the continent gained massive strength from the success of the foreign volunteers. The Royal Air Force emerged from the fierce battle as the premier aerial fighting force in the entire world. The massive crucible of combat had burned away the obsolete tactics and forged a weapon of pure defense. The British commanders recognized the immense value of embracing aggressive foreign allies and adapting to chaotic combat situations. The integration of the Polish Fury had transformed the rigid defensive network into a massive and flexible shield of steel. The massive lessons learned in the autumn sky would guide the Allied offensive in the coming years. The rugged Hawker Hurricane earned its permanent place in the eternal history of armored combat. The British engineers had built a massive machine capable of absorbing profound punishment and delivering a massive fatal blow. The Polish pilots revered the sturdy fighters that carried them through the chaotic fire of the bomber formations. The massive mechanical reliability of the aircraft was the absolute bedrock of the entire joint defensive effort. The British machine and the Polish warrior were a perfect match made in the dark fires of war. The German airmen who survived the intense battle carried the deep psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The memories of the green fighters diving out of the sun haunted their dark nightmares. The absolute sheer violence of the point-blank attacks defied all their previous experiences of standard aerial warfare. The enemy realized that the Allied forces possessed a terrifying reserve of profound human willpower. The psychological defeat was far more permanent than the physical loss of the bomber planes. The dark shadow over the island nation began to recede as the harsh winter approached. The fierce Polish pilots and their brave British brothers in arms stood victorious on the freezing grass airfields. The giant engine of the German offensive was broken and sputtering in the captured bases across the cold water. The men of the 303 Squadron wiped the massive oil from their hands and looked toward the east. The massive fight was far from over, but the tide of the war had experienced a profound turn. The invincible German war machine had met its absolute match in the skies over the Channel. The grand strategy of terror and absolute destruction failed against a massive wall of superior engineering and raw human courage. The exiled foreign volunteers and the dedicated local mechanics achieved the impossible in the face of absolute doom. The Dark Empire lost the vital war of the mind the moment the Polish warriors pulled their massive triggers. The skies belonged to the free men who refused to yield a single inch of the infinite blue. The battle over the island was not won by machines alone in the infinite blue. It was won by the profound union of desperate men and superior engineering. The Polish aviators and the British mechanics forged an unbreakable pact in the fires of intense combat. This shared trauma elevated their relationship from simple allies to bound brothers in arms. The blood spilled in the cold clouds cemented a legacy that transcends standard military history. Historians often focus on the cold numbers and the grand strategic movements of the rival empires. They track the production rates of the factories and the bomb payloads of the dark enemy aircraft. But the true essence of the fierce victory is found in the dirt of the British airfields. It exists in the silent nods between the grease-covered ground crews and the exhausted foreign volunteers. The human element of the brutal conflict remains the most vital and profound component of the Allied triumph. The British Hawker Hurricane stands as a permanent monument to the incredible power of industrial resilience. The designers of the rugged fighter plane never imagined the extreme limits their creation would face in active combat. They built a defensive tool for a structured and disciplined air force. The Polish pilots took that tool and transformed it into a weapon of pure and chaotic vengeance. The machine accommodated the sheer rage of the exiled warriors with absolute structural integrity. The integration of the fierce foreign volunteers into the Royal Air Force was a grand gamble. The British commanders risked the safety of their organized defensive network to inject raw aggression into the brutal battle. The decision required a profound amount of trust from the strict officers in the underground bunkers. The Polish men repaid that trust with a level of dedication that shocked the entire chain of command. The gamble paid immense dividends in the form of shattered German bombers and safe British cities. The concept of a shared defense erased the invisible borders that separated the men before the global war. A pilot from Warsaw and a mechanic from London found common ground under the metal wings of a fighter plane. They spoke different languages, but they shared the exact same profound desire to destroy the invading armada. The threat of absolute annihilation forced the men to focus on their shared purpose. The mutual respect born in the dark days of the battle created a unified front of steel and will. The The Polish pilots never forgot the generosity of the island nation that gave them a second chance to fight. Britain provided the safe harbor and the powerful weapons needed to strike back against the dark German Empire. The exiled men knew they were fighting for the survival of their hosts as much as for the honor of their lost home. The defense of the green English countryside became a sacred duty for the fierce foreign volunteers. They guarded the skies with the intense ferocity of men protecting their own kin. The British citizens recognized the immense sacrifice of the Polish warriors and embraced them as true heroes. The people of the island nation watched the contrails in the sky and understood the true cost of their freedom. The foreign pilots walked the streets of London and received the profound gratitude of the local population. The shared struggle against the intense bombing raids united the civilians and the military in a deep bond. The Polish men found a new sense of belonging in the brave heart of the embattled empire. The legacy of the 303 Squadron is a testament to the supreme power of the human spirit. The men lost their country and their friends, but they refused to surrender to dark despair. They channeled their profound grief into a focused and lethal aggression that broke the back of the enemy offensive. The Polish fury was a controlled explosion of pure will that utilized the British machines to maximum effect. The fierce warriors proved that a broken heart can become the most potent and dangerous weapon on Earth. The British military adapted and evolved due to the strong influence of the aggressive foreign volunteers. The rigid, tactical doctrines of the pre-war era dissolved in the intense heat of the close-quarters dogfights. The Royal Air Force learned to embrace the chaos and prioritize aggressive action over rigid formations. The infusion of the Polish combat style hardened the entire defensive network against future threats. The island nation became a fortress of supreme aerial dominance because it learned from its fierce guests. The memory of the fierce battles over the Channel serves as a profound lesson for all future generations. The brutal conflict demonstrated the extreme danger of underestimating the resolve of desperate and dedicated men. The German High Command believed their supreme numbers and superior technology guaranteed an absolute and fast victory. They failed to calculate the immense power of an alliance forged in absolute necessity and severe trauma. The Allied forces defeated the Dark Invasion through sheer stubbornness and brilliant mechanical cooperation. The rugged fighter planes of the era are now silent museum pieces resting in quiet hangars. The heavy Merlin engines no longer roar across the green fields of the English countryside. But the spirit of the men who maintained and flew those machines remains alive in the historical record. The silent black and white photographs capture the tired faces of the mechanics and the fierce eyes of the pilots. The images speak volumes of the immense burden carried by the Allied forces during the darkest hours of the global war. The British engineers who designed the Hawker Hurricane deserve a profound amount of historic recognition. They created the vital shield that allowed the Polish sword to strike the dark enemy formations. The sturdy airframe of the fighter plane was the absolute foundation of the entire Allied victory in the sky. The foreign volunteers could never have achieved their staggering kill records without the reliable British steel. The ultimate success of the defense was a perfect marriage of brilliant design and raw, aggressive execution. The mechanics who patched the bullet holes and loaded the heavy guns are the unsung heroes of the brutal battle. The British ground crews worked in absolute obscurity to ensure the fighter squadrons never missed a vital patrol. Their intense dedication and supreme physical endurance kept the defensive shield intact against the relentless German pressure. The Polish pilots understood the profound value of the men in the dirt and honored their tireless efforts. The air war was won on the ground by men armed with wrenches and thick, heavy fuel hoses. The bond between the pilot and the mechanic is a sacred and deep trust in the realm of aerial combat. The man in the cockpit bets his life on the expert skill and the profound attention of the man on the ground. The British technicians never failed the foreign volunteers who depended on their vast mechanical expertise. The Hawker Hurricanes always returned to the sky, ready to deliver brutal punishment to the enemy swarms. This absolute reliability allowed the Polish warriors to focus their entire intent on sheer destruction. The profound strategic impact of the 303 Squadron cannot be overstated in the grand scope of the war. The fierce foreign volunteers broke the momentum of the German offensive and saved the vital fighter bases from absolute ruin. Their aggressive tactics disrupted the enemy bombing raids and protected the vital industrial centers of the island nation. The Polish pilots bought the British Empire the precious time required to rebuild and prepare for the grand future counteroffensive. The historic victory in the air changed the entire trajectory of the global conflict. The courage of the exiled warriors inspired other captive nations to resist the dark German occupation. The immense success of the Polish pilots proved that the dark enemy war machine was vulnerable to aggressive and determined attacks. The news of the falling German bombers spread across the continent and ignited a bright fire of profound rebellion. The fierce actions in the sky over Britain fueled the brave resistance movements in the darkest corners of Europe. The foreign volunteers became shining symbols of hope for millions of oppressed and terrified people. The shared victory of the British and Polish forces stands as a monument to the pure power of Allied cooperation. The cultural differences in language and customs vanished when the men faced a common and fatal threat. The mutual desire to destroy the invading armada created a unified and invincible military force. The fierce battle proved that diverse nations can achieve incredible feats when they combine their unique strengths. The Allied victory was a beautiful triumph of shared values and profound human respect. The fierce engagements over the Channel exacted a terrible toll on the men of both nations. The green fields of England hold the silent graves of the brave pilots who never returned from the cold clouds. The British and Polish warriors rest together in the soil they fought so hard to defend from dark tyranny. The shared sacrifice seals the strong brotherhood of the Allied forces in a permanent and profound embrace. The fallen men purchased the precious freedom of the world with their own spilled blood. The survivors of the fierce battle carried the deep invisible scars of the extreme combat for the rest of their lives. The Polish pilots could never forget the deep trauma of losing their homeland and their dear friends. The British mechanics could never erase the sight of the shattered machines and the wounded men from their minds. The shared pain of the intense experience bound the veterans together long after the heavy guns fell silent. The brotherhood forged in the global war was a permanent condition of their very souls. The story of the 303 Squadron is a stark reminder of the profound debt owed to the past generations. The pure freedom enjoyed by modern society was secured by the fierce actions of desperate and brave men. The Polish volunteers and the British mechanics stood firm against the most dark and terrifying threat in human history. They refused to surrender the infinite sky and fought with a raw and profound courage that defies simple comprehension. The immortal legacy of their absolute sacrifice must be preserved and honored for all future time. The thick clouds over the Channel still carry the faint and distant echoes of the heavy Merlin engines. The air remains charged with the profound spiritual presence of the fierce warriors who dominated the infinite blue domain. The British and Polish forces achieved a glorious victory that will echo through the grand halls of history forever. The strong alliance of brilliant engineering and pure raw fury created an unstoppable force. The dark fascist empire was broken by the men who refused to yield a single inch of air. The epic story of the fierce foreign volunteers and their reliable British machines approaches its profound conclusion. The great battle was won, and the island nation remained a shining fortress of absolute light in a dark world. The Polish warriors achieved their absolute vengeance and earned the deepest respect of their gracious hosts. The grand stage is now set for the profound reflection on the ultimate cost of the brutal aerial conflict. The next and final chapter will close the book on the brave men of the 303. The story of the fierce Polish aviators and their reliable British machines remains a profound testament to raw human courage. These exiled warriors arrived on the island nation with broken hearts and a massive thirst for absolute vengeance. The strict British commanders took a massive gamble when they armed the foreign volunteers with their finest fighter planes. The rugged Hawker Hurricane proved to be the perfect mechanical shield for the aggressive and chaotic combat tactics of the Polish men. The combination of British engineering and foreign fury shattered the myth of the invincible German air armada. The enemy bomber crews experienced sheer terror when the green machines broke through their tight defensive formations. The brutal point-blank assaults erased the rigid discipline of the invading forces and sent them fleeing across the cold channel. The massive victory in the skies over the English countryside saved the free world from a dark and permanent occupation. But the true strength of the Allied defense was forged on the ground by the exhausted mechanics and the dedicated ground crews. The British technicians worked in the dirt and the oil to keep the massive engines running and the heavy guns loaded. A silent bond of profound mutual respect united the men of two different cultures in a single desperate mission. The Polish pilots trusted the British steel with their lives, and the mechanics honored that trust with tireless labor. The shared trauma of the brutal air war erased all borders and created an unbreakable brotherhood of spilled blood. The men of the 303 Squadron earned their place as the most lethal interceptor unit of the entire massive battle. They achieved their massive revenge, but they also paid a steep and bitter price in the freezing clouds. The green fields of the island nation hold the permanent graves of the brave men who never returned to the grass airstrips. Their absolute sacrifice secured the future of the British Empire and inspired a massive resistance across the captive continent. The legacy of the fierce foreign volunteers lives on in the cold statistics and the silent black and white photographs. The world must never forget the sheer courage required to charge a massive enemy bomber stream in a canvas and metal machine. The history of armored conflict is written by men who ignore their own fear to protect the people standing behind them. The immortal story of the Polish Fury and the British machines is a permanent monument to the supreme power of Allied unity. Picture yourself strapped into a metal seat miles above the earth with a swarm of enemy planes rushing toward your glass canopy. Drop a comment below and tell me how you would react to that absolute massive terror. Hit the subscribe button to join our pursuit of intense combat history. I will see you in the next dark chapter of human warfare.